Word of God, as far as I'm concerned, is very clear about this. As Deuteronomy 6, Deuteronomy 11 says, we are to be teaching our children about God and His ways and His laws and what He has done for us when we wake up in the morning, when we're walking by the way, when we're sitting down to eat, when we're going to bed at night. In other words, all the time, right? So it has been an incredible honor and privilege to have that responsibility imposed on us by God and to do our best to fulfill that responsibility.
Hi, welcome to the Zan Tyler podcast. This podcast is brought to you by BJU Press Homeschool. Homeschooling is an exciting adventure we take with our children. One of the most challenging parts of this journey is choosing the curriculum you want to use. BJU Press Homeschool is a curriculum you can trust. All the books, resources, and videos have been designed with you and your child in mind. Their curriculum is educationally robust and rich, taking into account that children have different learning styles, strengths, and needs. Mom, you are in charge. BJU Press Homeschool is here to come alongside and support you. Do you need help with the teaching load, or is there a subject you just don't want to teach? Their amazing video courses are available for all grades and almost every subject. BJU Press Homeschool believes that homeschooling can produce a new generation of students who know God, love their neighbors, and stand firm in their faith. For more information, go to bjupresshomeschool.com. That's bjupresshomeschool.com. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Zan Tyler podcast, where our goal is to help you thrive in your homeschool journey. Let me take just a minute to ask you to please subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen or watch, including YouTube. And if this podcast has been a blessing to you, please leave us a good review. Each review really helps. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We post a lot of content there as well. So today I am so privileged to welcome Alex Newman back to the podcast. Alex is an award-winning international journalist, educator, author, speaker, investor, nationally syndicated radio host, and consultant who seeks to glorify God in everything he does. And I think you'll see that as this podcast progresses. He's serving as president of Liberty Sentinel Media Incorporated. Over his career as a journalist, Alex has interviewed current and former heads of states, members of Congress, royalty, and countless other fascinating people. Most importantly to many of us, he is married to the love of his life, and together they have 6 children. So stay tuned. I think you will really be encouraged by this podcast. Alex, thank you so much for being here today.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Zan.
So where in the world have you been lately?
We've been doing a lot of travel, of course, and actually I had the blessing of being able to bring my wife and our new baby with us on some of the recent speaking events up in the north in Minnesota and Idaho, and just about to take off for India in a couple of days, so that'll be interesting.
Really? What are you going to be doing in India?
Mostly ministry work, and due to certain government restrictions, I have to kind of keep my head down. I got a big fat stamp in my passport that says journalistic activity is strictly prohibited, so I'm just wearing my tourist hat, and it's going to be great.
Oh, that's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So, Alex, tell us a little bit about your family. So you have a new baby, and you have 5 other children besides the new baby. Am I right?
That's right. Yep. So far, God has sent us 6, and it's an incredible blessing. The oldest has just turned 15, got his learner's permit. Woo-hoo! Just a few days ago. Heart attack, right? But no, it's we homeschool them and wouldn't trade it for the world. It's when God says that children are a blessing, you should take it seriously. It's absolutely true. Don't listen to the world. Listen to God. It's the greatest thing ever. So.
It is. Elizabeth Elliot said her greatest privilege in life was being somebody's mother. And boy, I can attest to that. And when my last daughter went off, my last child, my daughter went off to college, I thought I was going to die. You know, I spent a lot of days just crying. Some days I couldn't even make it to the sofa. Just this whole, you never stop being a mother, but those engaged days of being a mother. So finally, my husband said to me, we're going to start a new program. We're going to set the timer, and maybe you can go to the sofa and cry for 30 minutes.
No, it's so true. I can't even imagine what that would be like. It's incredible having watched the 15-year-old grow up so quickly. But I was just telling my brother yesterday, and it just occurred to me, one of my favorite things in the world to do is to spend time with my children. And it's so contrary to what the world tells you. Oh, it's a burden. Oh, you're going to have to sacrifice. Yeah, there's some sacrifice, but what could be more fun than spending time with the children that God has placed in your home?
Boy, that is so true. I know now I've got grandkids who are 18, 17, and on down to
Oh,
2.
wow.
And, it is I told my kids the other day, some of my grown kids, I said, "I just thought I loved you guys."
Right. That my dad always used to say, "If I had known grandkids were this good, I woulda had them
And
first."
first,
So
that's right. So, I can't believe we're gonna have some tearful goodbyes in the fall when our oldest grandchild goes off to college, and then the next year, our second. So, I time flies, and that's what's so important, that you spend the time with your kids now that you can, because you won't get those years back. And so to really enjoy those years is so important. Okay, so Alex, you did say you're a homeschooling dad, and this is a homeschooling podcast. So tell us how you got into homeschooling. Probably your story is totally unique among homeschooling families.
yeah, it's so funny, Zan. Before we started, you're like, "Yeah, we'll start off with a light subject." Like, "Oh, but our story is not gonna be that light." Uh, I'll try to condense, the story into a bite-size morsel here. But I was living in Sweden. God bless my wife, she's from there. I wouldn't have ended up there otherwise, I promise you. It's a nice place in some ways, but very totalitarian in a way I think that most Americans would just be shocked. And, we were waiting for the arrival of our first child. This would have been, 2009, 2000 I guess 2010. And, the government passed the Education Reform Act, which sounded rather innocuous, and it was coming from the center-right government, so nobody was really paying that much attention to it. And come to find the whole thing was an abomination. It conscripted all the private schools to essentially become government schools. They said, "Hey, we're already giving you money. You need to teach the government curriculum now." So that was bad enough. But then they banned homeschooling. And homeschooling was already, very limited in Sweden. The handful of families, there was about 200 families, that were doing it, and they were already under massive restrictions. They had to beg the government for permission. It's not like homeschooling was this huge phenomenon that was threatening the existence of government schools, but they decided to ban it. And, I was contacted by the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and they said, "Hey, Alex, I understand you live in Sweden. You're a journalist. The Swedish government's banning homeschooling. Could you look into this and see what's going on and maybe get us some information and maybe try to publicize some of this?" I'm like, "Okay." And so that was my first real true connection with the home education movement. Now, the home education movement in Sweden is very different than it is in the United States, far more secular. But these were great people. I mean, these were super loving parents who were really passionate about getting a great education for their children, and they were just bewildered. Like, we're not causing anybody any problems. Our children are doing fantastic. Why are they coming after us? And so what I saw there, Zan, was an unbelievable level of determination. Out of all those families that were homeschooling, not one single family that we know of complied and said, "Okay, here's my children." Right? The vast majority fled the country. A handful of them actually had their children kidnapped. It was one of the most heartbreaking things I ever saw in my life. There's one family in particular that I wrote about a lot for probably a half a dozen publications, the Johansson family. They were homeschooling on the island of Gotland, and the authorities decided that they wouldn't be allowed to homeschool. And so the family said, "All right, well, we're leaving. We're not going to stay." So they were going to fly back to India. The mother was from India. They were going to fly to India and continue their home education journey there. And they were on a Turkish Airlines flight to Istanbul, headed on to India. And armed police came on, seized the boy. He was about 8 years old at the time, if I'm not mistaken, Dominic, dragged him off the plane. And then the government told the child that it was because his parents didn't love him that the government had to intervene here and protect him from his parents. So the horror of all this was intermixed with a story of unbelievable passion and inspiration. And so there was a protest. About 100 of these homeschool families, in response to this Education Reform Act, they marched through downtown Stockholm, and I marched with them as a journalist. I wasn't a homeschooler at the time, but I marched with them just to document the event, taking pictures, talking to the folks there. They stopped at the education ministry, and I had already reached out to the education minister. The response was just, "Well, all children have a human right to education. All children have a human right to education." And then they marched to a ship in the port. And they got on board the ship, and about 100 families sailed off to Finland. They waved goodbye to their home country, their lives, their businesses, their homes, their families, and they arrived on the island of Åland, where the Finnish education minister came out and greeted them and welcomed them and told them that here in Finland, parents are in charge of the education of their children as per the Constitution. And I thought, something really significant is happening here. People don't do the kind of thing that I just witnessed for something small or insignificant or
Right.
unimportant. And that's
Right.
when my wife and I decided we need to spend more time looking at it. We already knew we weren't going to send our kids to a government school, but homeschooling hadn't really crossed our mind. But after that, that set us on the journey that eventually led us to deciding that, hey, we want to do this too.
So, how many years then have you been homeschooling?
From the very beginning, none of our children have ever been to a school. So 15 years now, we taught our oldest how to talk and how to walk, and then had to do math and how to read. We've been doing it all along, and we intend to continue as long as the Lord allows us to.
Okay, so we know how you started homeschooling. Alex, why do you continue homeschooling? Let me back up just a minute. So, this is the time of year when I know lots and lots of parents are trying to decide, am I going to homeschool again next year? It's sort of hard. Maybe this is the year to put our kids in school. Or maybe you're listening to the podcast and you're thinking about homeschooling, or you have friends who are thinking about homeschooling. Let me just encourage you that it is really worth the effort. You, like we said earlier, you don't get these years back with your kids. It's a great way to educate them and to disciple them. But Alex, I would love for you to tell them, we're calling this episode the new school year with Alex Newman. What has been the motivating factor in you and your wife continuing to homeschool?
That would be a list that would be way too long to go through, Zan. So I'll give you some of the highlights.
Okay, that'd be great.
Right. The first and most important is the Word of God, as far as I'm concerned, is very clear about this. As Deuteronomy 6, Deuteronomy 11 says, we are to be teaching our children about God and His ways and His laws and what He has done for us when we wake up in the morning, when we're walking by the way, when we're sitting down to eat, when we're going to bed at night. In other words, all the time, right? So it has been an incredible honor and privilege to have that responsibility imposed on us by God and to do our best to fulfill that responsibility. So I would say the first and most important reason is that I believe God has called us to. I don't mean to say that parents don't have liberty to maybe choose some other options. I certainly wouldn't think government school would be a legitimate option, but there are other ways that I think could satisfy what God has called us to do in terms of bringing up our children in the fear, discipline, admonition, and nurture of the Lord. But I think homeschooling most closely resembles what I see in the scriptures as far as how God expects us not just to educate His children ultimately, but also how to disciple them in the nurture and fear and the admonition of the Lord. So that's the main and most important reason. And if that was the only reason, that would be more than enough. But there are fringe
Absolutely.
benefits to it as well, right?
Yes, yes.
It is so much fun. People are surprised by that. Like, you have fun hanging out with your kids all day. They have more fun than you could possibly imagine. It's,
That's
we have done some of the most incredible things as a family. I try to bring them with me when I go places for work, if the budget allows that. So we have traveled the world together. We have done all kinds of things that normal families wouldn't get the chance to do because their kids are locked up in a school for 8 hours a day for 5 days a week. So the freedom that it allows, the good times, the influence that we're able to have over the minds and the hearts of our children is just unbelievably significant. I wouldn't trade it for the world. It brings us closer together as a family. It allows us to determine what the children ought to be learning instead of some bureaucrat that we don't know, some bureaucrat that may or may not share our values. In fact, almost certainly does not share our values. And last but not least, I talk a lot about government schools, so people always just assume that we homeschool because we're terrified of government schools. We should fear the Lord. I don't fear government schools. I despise what they're doing to children. But knowing what I know about the government education system, education in air quotes, I could not in good conscience send my children to those. And I don't say that from a position of judgment or criticizing other believers who may have come to a different conclusion. But knowing what I know about the people who set up this system, the effects that it's having on these children, I could never, in good conscience, do that. If you paid me all the money in the world, there's no way I would subject my children to that. And so those are just a few of the reasons then.
I wanna, we're gonna talk about your last reason a lot during, this podcast, but I wanna go back to the one where you said you just have fun together. I know my husband was really probably a visual kinesthetic learner, and he hated school. He just felt like he was chained to a desk for 12 years of his life and didn't wanna be. And I can remember he came home one day and the boys and I don't think Lizzie was born yet because she was born 7 years after my middle son. And, we had been studying the military. So he said, "What are y'all doing?" I said, "Well, I just decided we're going to Fort Jackson. We have a big army base here. We're gonna go walk around. We're gonna see if we can have a tour. We are going to watch the soldiers march, and then we're gonna come back home and talk about the military." And Joe said, "In my best dream, I would come back as a homeschooled boy." because because you can see and do so much, and I think people, when they're looking at homeschooling, don't understand that.
Yeah.
They don't understand that education involves all of life and traveling and having fun, and, I mean, it's certainly the academic work, but it's not limited to that, and,
Yeah. No, that's
so
exactly right, Zan, and we've had opportunities to do stuff that are just unthinkable to normal families who subject their children to a government school. In 2016 and then again in 2018, we traveled all through Europe. I think we hit like 45 different countries, and I was working, and I'm submitting articles for the New American and other publications, and I'm taking my kids to see the Colosseum and St. Peter's Basilica, and we're going to Malta and looking at, the ruins there, and we're going to Greece and looking at, the old ruins in Athens, and, that's stuff that normal people don't even think of as being possible because they're trapped in this mindset of, well, we got to send the kids to government school. And we got to tour the United States in 2019. I was on a speaking tour, and we saw all the Grand Canyon, and Glacier National Park, and the old historical sites in Philadelphia. And, why shouldn't people be able to do that? We've just been trapped into this idea that kids need, in air quotes, 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, sitting in a classroom. And frankly, knowing my boys, that's not how they learn. I got 5 sons. They're super bouncy. If they went to a government school, they'd be drugged. But they learn like
Yes,
this, and they love it.
yes, yes, yes. It's interesting. I just pulled out this quote. I was speaking at a retreat this past weekend, but I had forgotten it. It reminds me of what we're talking about, and it was by scholar and theologian J. Gresham Machen in a commencement address he wrote and he delivered in 1929, and he said, "The real indictment against the modern world is that by the modern world, human liberty is being destroyed. Liberty in present-day education is regarded as entirely out of date, and standardization has taken its place."
Yep.
And,
So true.
and so I just love what you're saying and reminding us of. Even if you're not world travelers because you or your husband don't have that as part of your job description, there is so much of the outdoors and the world you can experience when you have 24/7 to do that. So,
So true.
just one of the many blessings of homeschooling. So, I'm taking this out of order. I know that I sent Tammy some notes of things I wanted to talk about, with you, Alex, but if we're talking about the new school year with Alex Newman, one of the things I wanna cover is the importance of phonics in the educational process. So I had the privilege of interviewing you a little over a year ago, Alex, and we talked about your book, The Crimes of the Educator, your work with Samuel Blumenfeld. And I was a great believer in phonics. I had this 5th grade teacher who made us write paragraphs phonetically. I mean, she was such a believer. I mean, when by the time I left her room, I could have written all the phonetic spellings of any dictionary, in the world. But the thing I didn't understand is not only in the importance of teaching children to read through phonics, but the dangers of not using phonics. So we're going back to the book, The Crimes of the Educators. But can you tell us a little bit just about the importance of phonics and what happens when we don't do that?
Yeah, thank you, Zan. This is a topic I'm so passionate about. We have a phonetic writing system, okay? And that necessitates teaching, reading, and writing through phonics. And what that means for the folks out there who aren't familiar with this terminology, our writing system consists of symbols, and each symbol represents not an idea, like in the hieroglyphic or ideographic writing systems like China or some of the stuff that came out of Egypt. But our system, we have symbols that represent sounds. So a P makes a P sound, and an F makes a F sound. And you cannot properly understand what the symbols mean if you don't understand that each one is associated with one or more sounds, and then those blend together in a particular way to ultimately make a phonetic sound. And the sound then is what our brain interprets as having some particular meaning. So we have a writing system that's unique. It's actually a huge step forward in the development of human communication. I mean, the ancient Hebrews had some of this, and then the Phoenicians. But this is a huge advantage over some of the other writing systems where, for example, one symbol represents an idea or a word or something like that. And what happened was in the mid 1800s, there was a particular individual who's very well known, although not for this. His name was Horace Mann. He came up with the idea that this system that they had developed to try to teach deaf children how to read might also be applied to non-deaf children. And I should explain that for a moment, right? Deaf children cannot hear sounds. So you can't explain to a deaf child that a P makes a P sound because they can't hear it. And so these very, very nice Christian people who were helping deaf children. The Reverend was Reverend Golodet. He was running the Asylum for the Deaf and Dumb in Connecticut, in Hartford at the time. And he thought, well, maybe we could teach these deaf children to read by having them memorize entire words as if the words themselves were symbols. Now, for deaf children, I will concede any day of the week, this was a really significant development because it allowed them to decode some of what was on a page. If they could memorize a few hundred or even a few thousand words, suddenly they could make sense of what was on a page. But we have lots more words than that in the English language. There's no way that even a brilliant individual can memorize all those words. And plus, it's not the way that our writing system was designed. So when Horace Mann applied this to non-deaf children in the burgeoning government schools of Boston under his leadership back in the mid-1800s, it was a catastrophe. I mean, it was so bad that all the schoolmasters in Boston got together and wrote a very diplomatic letter basically telling them this was quackery. We're not going to do it anymore. This isn't how kids learn how to read. So you would have thought that'd be the end of it, right? We wouldn't do it again. But then John Dewey resurrected this. And it became the dominant form of instruction across the government school system and even many private schools in the United States for most of the last century. And now people are starting to wake up and realize this was a big mistake. Plenty of people were sounding the alarm in the 40s and the 50s, in the 70s, all the way up to today. But now it's starting to be known. But what this has produced, Zan, is an illiteracy crisis that would absolutely boggle the mind of the average American. The last time the federal government did a comprehensive literacy survey was back in the 1990s, and they found that 50% of Americans read in the lowest two categories out of five. In other words, they're functionally illiterate. And it doesn't have to be this way. If you just teach children with phonics, like my wife and I did with our children, my wife actually taught at our co-op, all these kids, right, 5, 6, 7 years old, they'll be able to read the King James Bible, no problem, with just a few months of basic instruction. So this is something I'm obviously very passionate about, Zan, and it breaks my heart that so many children have been crippled through the quackery.
You know, so not only can they not read, but in your book, you talk about how it leads to depression, increased in delinquency. I think some of the Rockefeller boys couldn't read because they
Yep.
had been taught by the whole word method. So, so can you speak about that just a little bit about what it leads to when a child isn't taught phonetically?
Yeah, it produces all of those things you just described, and for obvious reasons, right? I mean, here you have these little bright-eyed and bushy-tailed kids that show up at school, and they think they're pretty smart, and, they've figured out how to talk and how to walk and how to eat and tie their shoes. Life is good. And then they get there, and after a couple of years of learning to read, quote unquote, they find that they can't read, right? They're just perplexed. And then suddenly they're told that they have some disability or they have some problem, they have some disorder, that they need special supports or an individualized education plan. And suddenly they feel demoralized. It's what some kids can read. Why can't I? Am I stupid? I mean, what's wrong? And of course, that produces depression, that produces feelings of insecurity, in addition to all the problems with not being able to read, right?
You're right, right.
That leads then to massive interventions that are totally unnecessary. It causes kids to be totally uninterested in education. They rebel, they act out, they get in trouble with the law. And what you see, you're just looking at the jail population. The vast majority of the folks in jail are illiterate. And I would suggest that there is an obvious, not just correlation here, but there's an obvious causation here. When you're illiterate, life becomes more difficult. You're more inclined to rebel. And it produces just so many problems. You mentioned the Rockefellers. So here's one of the ways that we know this was deliberate, Zan. And this is what people have, I think, the most trouble with is, could they have done this on purpose? And I believe, and Dr. Sam Blumenfeld, who mentored me for a number of years as we were working on Crimes of the Educators, he'd been sounding the alarm on this for 50 years before he and I hooked up. He had looked into the process for how this came to be the dominant form of reading instruction in the United States, because this didn't take root in other places. This was a uniquely American phenomenon. And what he found was John Dewey, who's almost universally regarded as kind of the founding father of the public school system in America. I think, honestly, he deserves to share some of the blame with some others. But he hooked up with John D. Rockefeller, and they set up an experimental school at the University of Chicago. And Rockefeller actually sent some of his children there. And what happened was these children ended up not being able to read. And some of them spoke publicly about this. Now, for them, it wasn't that big a deal. They had the money to hire secretaries and assistants, and they could have people write their letters for them. But John Dewey and the people associated with this experimental school knew full well that this quackery was producing children who could not read or write properly.
And so this was a non-phonics base. They were teaching
Right.
whole word or
Yes,
some
they
other.
were teaching
Okay.
children, just like they were teaching deaf children in the
Okay.
mid and early 1800s, to
Okay.
memorize entire words. And so the consequences of that were devastating. And then John Dewey took the data that he was getting out of his experimental school and then tried to apply these same methods to the entire education system of the United States. So that's how we went from the most literate nation in the history of the world to now a nation that is lower in terms of reading than almost anywhere else in the planet, including, by the way, some really poor places where they have hardly any institutional education.
I would say that's probably one reason why homeschool students have excelled over the years, maybe more than their peers, is that most homeschoolers, I'm sure not all, but most homeschoolers use phonetically based reading programs.
Mm-hmm.
And can you imagine not being able to read?
I can't.
I
I
mean,
remember like it was yesterday. I was in first grade in Mexico City, and I remember the teacher drilling us on the sound of the letters. I think, this is cool. I can decode what's on a page. And then to find out that there are children in America who go 18 years of quote unquote education and never figure out that each letter represents a sound. For me, it was just mind blowing.
So I'm sure you've kept up with I think she was had a Hispanic background and was in New York or Connecticut, and she's suing the school district because she went to college on a scholarship and can't read a word. She had
Yes.
apps that did some reading for her and translation for her, and it's interesting. I was just going over the homeschool laws in South Carolina, and the first law we got passed, which was really bad, it's not the freedom law that we have now, but it was a step in the right direction. The school district says we can't hold them accountable for any deficiencies that happen in our children's education because they're homeschooled. And I'm thinking, okay, let's talk about the deficiencies in the public school system because South Carolina at the time was either 49th or 50th in the nation in terms of how we were doing academically. And so that really, I'm sorry, that had nothing to do with anything, but I read that and it made me mad all over.
Well, Zan, it's like in Illinois right now. You've got the legislature considering a bill to force all these crazy new requirements on homeschoolers, and their thinking is, well, we got to make sure they're doing okay academically. We got to make sure they're not being abused. You got more than 1 in 10 of the victims of public schools being sexually abused, according to the government's own data. You got less than 1 in 3 who's proficient in reading or math. You've got dozens of schools across the state that can't produce one single student who's proficient in English or math. And you want to target homeschoolers who are, on average, way above where these people in the government schools are. It's just infuriating.
I know. Where is the accountability? If we're gonna
Mhm.
have that level of accountability, let's do it across the board, starting with the public school system.
Absolutely. I mean, the government can't educate the children that they've already got, and now they want to come for the children who are getting a world-class education. It is just nonsensical.
It reminds me, one of my favorite stories, I worked a lot Mike Ferris worked a lot with us, in South Carolina, and he was the founder of Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and he loved to tell the story about this, this young woman from a different state. She was a young child, actually, and she was learning disabled. She had been labeled learning disabled in the schools, and her mother wanted to homeschool her. Well, the school district said no because she's learning disabled, she needs to be in our schools. So Mike worked and, they were able to get this mom the ability to homeschool her. And so then 2 years later, when she's taken a nationally normed test, the public school says, oh, she's a talented and gifted child because that's what had happened in 2 years of homeschooling. And now we don't think you should homeschool her because she's talented and gifted and needs
Oh,
what our
wow.
programs have to offer. So, you're gonna find good administrators in the public school system. You're going to find Christian teachers, you know, thank the Lord they're there. But you do need to be careful. I guess what I want to say is you don't need to be afraid of homeschooling.
Amen.
I think the statistics speak for themselves. And as you say, gosh, I've read so much of the stuff you've written, Alex. I can't remember where I've read what, but really, there's two kinds of education: an education that leads your children towards God or away from God.
That's right.
And I think as Christian parents, that choice is easy. We want them to have an education that affirms their faith. I remember one of the statistics I read from Barna was how few adults are concerned about the faith of their children anymore. And
Yep.
so
And Jesus warned us about that very clearly. He's quoted in the Gospel of Matthew, and he's quoted in the Gospel of Luke, saying, "Whoever's not with me is against me." And so, folks, I challenge anybody to make a credible argument that the government school system we have today is with Christ. And like you said, Zan, there are great Christian people working in the system, and I'm very glad for the light that they're able to reflect within this very dark system. But we have to be honest with ourselves as Christians and say, look, this is not a system that is glorifying God. In fact, it's a system that is working to undermine trust and faith in His Word and in His principles. And as Christians, I think we need to really take that very seriously when we're dealing with the children that God has entrusted us with.
thank you for joining Alex and me today for part one of this two-part episode as we discuss the many benefits of homeschooling for your family. You can find Alex at libertysentinel.org, and as always, you can find me at zantyler.com and on social media. May God continue to bless you and your family, and until next time, bye.